To visit with you this evening about weed control in pastures, and appreciate the opportunity to share some of what we've learned through some of the research that we've conducted here at Utah State. I know I show this almost every time, but it's really critical that you properly identify the weeds that you're trying to manage, and we have some resources that are available online that you can look at, including the one that has the common weeds as well as this one, which contains the noxious weeds that are declared noxious by the state. I think really critical to the discussion this evening, though, is this idea of weed life cycles. And we know that we have annuals, either winter or summer annuals, biennials, and perennials. And then within those, we have different types of management approaches. So if we're thinking about annuals, really all we need to do to control an annual is prevent it from successfully going from seed to a seedling. And so pre-emergent herbicides often work there. But if we're managing something that comes from seed every year, we need to be aware that we're going to have to manage that seed bank, the seeds that are in the soil that come back year after year. With biennials, what's challenging about those is we may be managing several different growth stages that are all present at the time we treat. So we could have bolted plants that are in flower, rosettes that will bolt the following year and flower, and then we could have new seedlings that are going to develop into rosettes through the season. And so the timing of applications to these can be tricky because of those different life stages. And then again, because they do reproduce from seed, we're going to need to be conscious of that soil seed bank. And then in perennial crops, we find that here specific timing based on the herbicide and the species that we're managing is very critical to controlling these really difficult plants. And again, we may need to think about the soil seed bank when we're managing perennials as well. So some of the topics I want to talk about is just some overall integrated management, and it plays really well with some of the things that Michael just mentioned. And then we're just going to talk about some herbicide options for annual weeds, biennial weeds, and perennial weeds, and some of the things that we've learned. So this is kind of the thoughtful approach to controlling weeds in pasture. And we need to ask ourselves, what caused the weeds in the first place? And the answer to that question helps us to control our weeds. So is it an overgrazing issue? Or are we grazing at the wrong time with the wrong animals? Are there some soil issues, either fertility, salt, or texture? Are we irrigating too much, or is there too little irrigation? And then what Michael just talked about specifically was, is the seed mixture or the species that is growing in that pasture suited for the environment that it is in? And of course, so if we want to control weeds in our pasture, we really need to have proper irrigation and soil fertility and proper grazing management. In a pasture, we can mow to prevent certain species from going to seed. And then kind of a preventative approach would be spot spraying any weeds that show up as soon as you notice those. We often talk about biological, mechanical, and chemical controls. And so, you know, in some instances, you can use animals to graze weeds. Some of the people I visited with say that their cattle like to eat the tops off Dyer's Woad. But here's a picture of a pasture with goats through, and because goats through is toxic, of course, the animals are not going to eat that plant. They're going to avoid it. And because as that plant becomes more widespread, those animals will put more pressure on the grasses that are left in the pasture as they look for feed as it becomes limiting. Also, you can hand pull. So here's some work that Steve Dewey did years ago, where he went back to the same patch year after year, and they pulled all of the Dyer's Woad plants on that site. And you can see in the first year, they spent 100 hours. By the second year, it was half of that. But you can see that before they actually got to the point where there are no more seeds left in the seed bank to germinate, they were out over 12 years. I think eventually it was 17 years before they had a season where no plants emerged from the soil. So again, that seed bank can be quite long and persist for a long time. And then in addition to that, we need to just think about the condition of the pasture. If it is so degraded, we need to think about either restoring it or just rejuvenating it. And so that idea of overseeding, which is nice that in pasture we can have some success overseeding the pasture as compared to like an alfalfa crop. Adding some fertilizer to give those grasses a competitive advantage, improving our irrigation, and then again, just trying to clean that up with spot treatments with a backpack. So let's talk just for a moment about some of the herbicides that are registered for use in pasture. And this is not a recommendation, but just kind of a list to show you that there are a lot of herbicides out there. And some of the ones that we've worked with, I have highlighted. One of the newest products to be labeled is Duracor, which is a combination of Milestone plus a new molecule. And I'm going to touch on that. So Milestone and Duracor are very closely related. Another new use is Roundup at low rates in pasture, applied when the pasture grasses are dormant. And then Prowl H2 is also fairly new. Another one I just want to point out would be AIM. And AIM is registered for use in pasture grasses, but also has some registration in legumes. And so that's the one product that could be used in a mixed pasture, although it is a contact type herbicide. And so it's not very good at controlling anything other than some small annual weeds. Okay, here's the warning I want to throw out there, and that is on the Milestone, Duracor, and TerraView labels, you will find forage and manure management guidelines. And basically, these products persist in the droppings of animals. And so if you use these products, you need to make sure that the hay or the grass is consumed on your farm, and that the manure from animals eating that grass does not make it onto an alfalfa field or into compost or anything else. And so this also has, again, it restricts you from selling that hay off from the farm. But these products are very effective if you're using them on permanent pasture and can keep your animals from coming onto agricultural lands. I just want to make you aware of that restriction. Some others like Transline and Tordine also have some restrictions on moving animals, but they are not as severe as these newer products. So let's talk about some annual weeds. And really, actually, we're not going to talk about annual weeds. In irrigated pasture, if we're battling annual weeds, I really think we need to go back to the beginning and think about why are we having a problem with annual weeds. A good, healthy, competitive pasture can go a long way in keeping out a lot of annual weed species. And if we are having problems, usually something like 2,4-D or another growth regulator herbicide can be used to clean up many of those annual weeds. Biennial weeds, though, are much more difficult. And we find that when we get into the biennial weeds, that their management can be very specific and certain herbicides more effective than others. And so just an example of some that we've done work with would include musk thistle, buckhorn plantain, and hound's tongue, and some pretty tough weeds. Well, it's interesting when you look at musk thistle, Milestone works great on musk thistle and most thistles. And Duracor, because it's Milestone just with another product added, also does a great job. And then Escort and Tel are also very active on these biennial thistles. A lot of work has been done on buckhorn plantain, and previously the only product that showed any level of long-term control was Tordon. And of course, that's not, that's a restricted use pesticide and only works in certain environments. We've trialed Milestone on it, and Milestone has very minimal impact on it. But in the trials where we tested Duracor, it looks phenomenal. So the new molecule that they added to Milestone to make Duracor is allowing that herbicide now to effectively control buckhorn plantain. keep in mind that this would not be in a crop rotation setting, but in a permanent pasture. And then we did trials with Duracor on houndstooth, and it turns out that Duracor doesn't really control houndstooth well at all. But the standbys of Escort or Telar are very effective. Either of those at an ounce are providing excellent control. And then here's another biennial weed, Dyer's woad, and I want to show you some results from some work on that because I find it quite interesting. So this chart shows the number of plants in the plots that we tried, either the untreated on the left or dicamba or clarity, Telar, Escort, 2,4-D at a low rate, plateau, and then combinations with indaziflam, which is not registered for pasture, but is registered for range. And I just want to show you that the year after application, only those herbicides that had a residual in them, like indaziflam, reduced the density. But if you look at those densities based on the growth stage, what we see is that Telar and Escort were really effective at controlling the bolted plants, so the rosettes from the previous year, as well as the rosettes, but had little impact on seedlings. Imazapic also had a good effect and some effect on the seedlings because of its residual. And then any of those treatments that had the indaziflam, what we see is that the indaziflam controlled those seedlings. And so the point here is that you can get frustrated spraying Dyer's woad. You can spray it, you see that you burn it down and you kill all the plants, and then the next year you have this massive population. And again, you have to think about managing the seed bank. It's going to come back from that seed bank every year until you deplete it. Okay, so let's talk about some perennial weeds. I think when we talk about perennial weed control, we need to think about how the herbicide moves into the plant. And many of you have seen this before, but of course, sugars in the plant move from the source to the sink. Meaning if you spray a perennial plant in the spring, when the sugars are moving to the new growing points of the plant, you're not going to get herbicide to the roots. And so in general, we like to spray perennial plants when they're either in full bloom or after a hard frost, when sugars are moving towards the roots of these plants. So some simple perennials that we've looked at include elongated mustard, which is a new species that's spreading here in northern Utah. Cutleaf vipergrass, which is a fairly newly identified species, although it's widespread. And we've done some work with that around Sulphurdale. And then curly dock, which you see often in wet type pastures. And interesting on the mustard, we see Telar, 2,4-D, and plateau work really well. Milestone in general does not do a good job controlling mustards. On the cutleaf vipergrass, Telar or Milestone were the most effective. And then in curly dock, we see that Telar or 2,4-D plus clarity was some of the effective treatments. So just to show you the elongated mustard, again, this is plant density. And so what we see here is that many herbicides reduce the plant density 1 year after treatment, or at one site they reduce density, but really chlorsulfuron and metsulfuron are showing some of the longer term control, probably because of the residual that's in the soil. For cutleaf vipergrass, again, we saw that Milestone and Telar at 1 year after and 2 year, but by 3 year after treatment, those herbicides are gone, and that population, because it seeds from little tufts, returns with a vengeance. Curly dock, again, just metsulfuron, Escort, and 2,4-D plus clarity were the only two that provided good control of that species. And then in goat's rue, we've done a lot of work with that, and we find that there are quite a few products that will control goat's rue, but Telar is among the most active when we test it in the lab. Some creeping perennials we've looked at include Russian knapweed, white top or hoary cress, and perennial pepperweed. And again, anything in the sunflower family, Milestone seems to be very active, and especially active on the knapweed family. For white top, we see that Escort or Telar are highly effective, as well as on perennial pepperweed. And just one chart here, we just started another trial here in Utah, but it shows different stages of application from early bud through full bloom, and then a fall application. And this is 1 year after treatment. You can see that Telar Escort are far superior to the 2,4-D treatment. And we hope to see how these treatments fall out when we look at 2 years after treatment. If I have a minute left, I just want to talk about once your pasture is highly degraded, you've had an invasion of Russian olives. There are lots of ways to cut those down or grind those or pull them up. And some work we did out in Emery County looked at pre-treating the base of the tree with a Garlon in methylated seed oil of diesel. And basically what we find is if you pre-treat those trees before you do the cut or grind or uprooting, in most cases you get a significant improvement in the level of control. Obviously you can see between the cut only and the pre-treatment with the herbicides. It works really nice on the grinding because if you're trying to paint the stump, once you've ground it, it's pretty hard to find the stump amidst the debris and the soil. So in conclusion, when we talk about weed control in pasture, each species often requires a different herbicide and timing for effective control. And again, if we can do everything we can to maintain a healthy pasture, many of those problems can be prevented, both from invasion by annuals or biennials. And you know, when push comes to shove, a good old shovel works pretty well controlling things like the biennial thistles. So I don't know if I have some more time, but if there are some questions, I'd be happy to try and answer those.
Okay, Corey, we got a couple questions. We got about 2 minutes, so we'll try. Okay. This question Michael actually answered, but I'm going to throw it to you just because of your presentation. But what herbicide is best for managing unwanted foxtail in ditches and pastures?
Yeah, so I assume you're talking about foxtail barley, and it is a tough one. We tested a product called Lambient. It's registered as Lambient. It is very active on foxtail barley, but our trials also show that it's very active on many of our pasture grasses. So if you look at the label, you know, there are not a lot of species on there that we would plant in our pasture. They're more range type species. One of the things we want to look at is that new registration of low rates of glyphosate applied in the dormant season, maybe combined with prowl, to see if we can control the perennial plants, you know, late winter, just before the desirables come out of dormancy, and then have the pre-emergent prevent germination. Curb herbicide, we hope, will be available for use in pasture in a couple of years. Residue data is being developed on that to submit to EPA to get that approved. So that would give us a very effective tool as well.
Perfect. And there is one more question. We might move on. The question is, do those restrictions apply to seed production? And I think we just might need to know what the restrictions are specifically, unless you know what this question is real quick.
Yeah, many of those herbicides prevent their use in seed production. So yeah, it's not only the movement of the hay, but you wouldn't want to use them in your seed fields because you might lose yield.
Perfect.